Norway in winter does not look like a country in which a person easily thinks about the future. Everything here feels too ancient, too cold, too indifferent to human plans. The cliffs stand as though they care nothing for states, armies, or the flags that happen to fly above towns on any given day. The wind comes down from the mountains without mercy. Snow settles not as decoration, but as a heavy silence, and even the water seems less alive than metallic. If you stare at these landscapes for too long, it begins to feel as though the land itself was created not for life, but for trial. It does not drive a man away at once, nor destroy him with a single blow, but places before him such a measure of silence, cold, and isolation that every weakness quickly becomes visible. And yet it is in such places that the most subtle, precise, and dangerous stories of war are sometimes born. Not the ones where thousands meet in a frontal clash, not the ones where the front roars across hundreds of miles, not the ones where divisions and corps decide the fate of a day, but the ones in which the movement of history suddenly narrows to a few figures crossing snow at night, to a few steps down an icy slope, to a few charges laid in exactly the right place, to a few men forced to endure more than can reasonably be asked of them. The story of the Norwegian heavy water sabotage begins with precisely that feeling. The sense that in one distant, frozen place, barely noticeable to most of the world, something was happening that could not be allowed to continue on its own. Vemork was not a capital. It was not a vast military center. It was not a place spoken about in public squares. It was a factory among the mountains, in an occupied country, in severe country where industry and nature seemed equally hostile to man, though each in its own way. The plant stood near Rjukan, in Telemark, among rock, elevation, a deep gorge, and that special northern emptiness that makes every journey harder than it ought to be on a map. On paper, it might all have looked dry enough. A facility, a production line, a technological chain, a significant resource. But war has a way of turning dry words into anxious ones. Heavy water, a phrase that in peacetime would have sounded almost academic, began during the war to provoke very different thoughts. The issue was not the substance itself. It was not a bomb. It was not a weapon one could hold in one's hands. But it was tied to nuclear research, and therefore to that region of war where there was not yet full clarity, but already more than enough fear. The Allies could not afford the luxury of waiting until every uncertainty had been resolved. History rarely warns twice before a catastrophe. No one at the time could say with absolute confidence exactly where German work would lead, how far it had advanced, or what might come of it in 6 months or a year. But one thing could be said, and it was enough. If Germany was working along a path the Allies considered potentially catastrophic, and if Vemork was one of the nodes along that path, then Vemork had to be stopped. That is how the plant became a target. Not like a bridge that must be blown, not like a convoy that must be ambushed, not like a headquarters that must be captured. It was a target of a more nervous, heavier kind, because what mattered here was not merely wrecking a structure, but interrupting a process, derailing a sequence of events that, if left alone, might one day culminate in something too large, too late, and too terrible. To understand how deeply this task entered the war, one must first understand Norway as an occupied country. Occupation never changes only the flags. It changes the very air of daily life. It changes the way a person looks at a road, a train, a bridge, a stranger, even his own voice. Civilian life does not disappear at once. It seems to continue by inertia, but with a crack running through it. The same streets, the same houses, the same mountains, the same water, and yet everything is already altered, because above you and around you now lives a foreign will. And that will does not merely command. It watches, counts, distributes fear, measures obedience, and assigns a price to every movement. That was how Norway lived under occupation. For some, war took the form of orders, arrests, checkpoints, and garrisons. For others, It began as a slow inward refusal to accept the new reality as final. Resistance does not always begin with a weapon. Sometimes it begins with a person ceasing to regard foreign rule as natural, with a small inner no that changes nothing on the outside at first and everything on the inside. But an inward refusal is not enough when a single object may carry consequences beyond one nation. Here, something more was needed than hatred of the occupier. What was needed was cold discipline, endurance, knowledge of the land, the ability to disappear, the ability to remain silent, the ability to survive where a normal man begins thinking only about warmth and food. The Allies began looking for a way to reach Vemork, and very quickly it became clear that there was no easy one. The plant was defended not only by guards, it was defended by Norway itself. It stood in terrain that was already a natural fortress: steep slopes, narrow approaches, a gorge, a bridge, depth, height, snow, darkness, roads on which any stranger could be noticed. Any crude solution, a large raid, a frontal assault, a loud strike, would almost certainly have collapsed into disaster. A bombing attack from the air offered no guarantee either. One might damage structures without destroying exactly what had to be destroyed. One might interrupt the work without truly breaking its foundation. So one path remained: a small team, a hidden approach, a precise strike. Even that was not enough by itself. The task did not call merely for well-trained soldiers. It called for men who understood cold not intellectually but physically, men who did not lose themselves in snow, men who could endure wind, stone, hunger, and long waiting inside a white emptiness. It called for Norwegians. That is how the war chose those who would have to walk its narrowest edge. The first group was dropped in advance. Their job was not to attack, but to prepare, to scout the area, study the approaches, await the next phase, and become a living thread between Britain and the frozen Norwegian emptiness. It sounds almost simple until one understands what it means to be dropped into winter mountains with limited supplies, under constant risk of detection, while bearing the responsibility not merely to survive, but to preserve the ability to act. This is where the real weight of the story begins. Because heroism in peacetime imagination is often tied to a moment, a shot, a leap, an assault, an explosion. But the inner cost of war often reveals itself not in the moment, but in duration, in the fact that a man must live for weeks in a place that seems determined to draw the will out of him. That was the position of the first group. They waited in the mountains, held on, rationed food, thought more about warmth than about glory, looked at snow not as beauty, but as something that could hide a man and kill him with equal ease. They tried to leave no trace, tried not to let exhaustion harden into numb fatalism, tried not to let waiting itself do the enemy's work. Winter hunger is a special enemy. It does not simply remind a man of itself. It enters every thought, every calculation, every movement. A man begins to see distance differently, strength differently, time differently. Any walk over snow that in summer would have seemed merely unpleasant becomes a question of endurance. Any mistake costs more. Every small thing acquires weight: a dry glove, a chance to rest, a scrap of food, a little warmth, a little silence. All of these cease to be details of life and become part of survival itself. While the first group waited, Britain prepared the next phase. The main sabotage party was to arrive by glider. Even now the decision carries a built-in dread. In winter Norway, at night, over difficult terrain, it was something close to a bargain with chance. A glider requires precision. Weather requires obedience. Mountains offer neither. But war rarely presents good choices. Sometimes there are only those that look dangerous and those that look impossible. Then came what war so often does to carefully prepared plans. Reality proved stronger than design. The operation, later remembered as Freshman, ended in disaster. The gliders crashed. The men who were meant to become the main striking force never reached the target. Those who survived the crash fell into German hands. Interrogations followed. Executions followed after that. Everything happened exactly as war likes to break human intention, abruptly, coldly, and without granting the defeated the dignity of a clean correction. This moment matters especially because it is here that the story shows its true face. Retellings of heroic missions often smooth over the first failure in order to arrive more quickly at later success. But in reality, it is precisely the failure that makes the success heavier, costlier, and more honest. After the catastrophe of Freshmen, everything might have ended. That would have been logical. The mission had failed, men had died, the Germans were now more alert, and the price had already become dreadful. Any staff might have concluded that another attempt would cost too much and achieve too little. But the first group was still in the mountains. That fact gives the whole story its deepest human weight. They were not a heroic image on a poster. They were a handful of living men in the snow, knowing that those they had waited for had crashed and been killed. Now they had to decide what their own existence was becoming. Pointless waiting, quiet disappearance, or the continuation of a mission that had already once drowned in catastrophe. They went on waiting, and it was from that stubborn, quiet continuation that everything that followed would grow. This is where one must slow down and understand what waiting costs after failure. Before disaster, waiting is anticipation. After disaster, waiting becomes an inward argument with oneself. Does anything remain to continue for? Is there still a mission, or only the memory of one? If a man remains after such a blow, he no longer remains out of innocence. He remains out of something harder, out of the inward decision not to allow the first disaster to become the final answer. Later, a new group of Norwegians trained in Britain joined them. Among them was Joachim Rønneberg, a man whose name would later become inseparable from Vemork. He did not resemble a theatrical hero, and that is one reason he belongs so completely to this story. This is not a tale that rewards theatricality. It rewards precision, discipline, and inward composure. Now the operation depended on them. What they had to do is difficult to understand for anyone who has never crossed winter mountain ground at night while knowing that error does not merely mean failure, but an end. The route to the plant was a trial in itself. It required more than courage. It required endurance, silence, attention, physical steadiness, and a kind of inner coldness. Courage without discipline in such an operation would have amounted to nothing but an early collapse. They moved through snow, rock, and wind. Night in the mountains makes the world smaller. Sounds sharpen. The crunch beneath one's boots seems too loud. Darkness does not fully conceal, rather it constantly demands that a man move correctly. If he moves too quickly, he tires and errs. If too slowly, the night itself begins to work against him. Everything must be kept in measure. That was the terrible maturity of the mission. There was no place here for dramatic impulse. There was only precision. To reach the plant, they had to descend into the gorge. The descent itself seems almost symbolic. In order to approach the target, they first had to go downward, into depth, into stone shadow, into a place where any human figure appears especially fragile. Below them was dark water, cold, slick rock, and the sensation that the landscape itself was watching. Then came the climb back up on the other side, toward the facility, where the target was close enough to make every movement more dangerous. They took that route. One can speak endlessly of bravery, but the real tension of this story lies in how nearly wordless everything was. A few men, snow, darkness, heavy steps, attention given to each movement. Not battle in the usual sense, not noise, but time compressed inwardly until every next step had to be the right one. They moved not as a party full of confidence, but as men who understood too well the cost of every small thing. A slope beneath the foot might give way. A stone might betray a sound. Snow might preserve a print where none could be left. One careless motion might make useless the work of months. And yet they kept moving, slowly, soberly, without the kind of excess heroism that often ruins exactly the kind of operation it imagines itself to ennoble. By the time they reached the plant, they had already done something immense, though invisible. They had brought their minds to a state where fear no longer dictated their rhythm. Fear still existed, as it had to, but it no longer set the tempo. That is rarer than bravery and more valuable. They entered the plant. In stories like this moment is often told too quickly. Entered, found, placed, left. But its true weight appears only when one realizes how much already stood behind each motion of the hand. Behind the way a man steps into a forbidden place. Behind the way he orients himself in unfamiliar rooms. Behind the way he searches for the necessary equipment knowing that time is short and that any mistake may turn sabotage into a fight that no one involved can hope to survive. They reached the equipment connected with the production of heavy water. They set the charges. They did what they had come to do, and they left. The explosions came after they were gone. The Germans were struck not only by the damage, but by the character of the blow. This had not been an army's assault, not a raid of noise and fire, not a frontal attack. It was a cold, exact, almost surgical strike delivered against a supposedly secure site in one of the harshest landscapes imaginable. Yet even that was not the end of the story. War almost never ends with the first success. It answers, rebuilds, salvages, seeks another path. The Germans began to recover what they could and decided to move what remained valuable. With that decision, a new vulnerability appeared. And where vulnerability appears in war, so does another chapter. That is where the ferry hydro enters the story. Lake Tin, across which the cargo would travel, presents another kind of wartime stage. No gorge now, no factory chamber, no silent infiltration among metal and concrete. Here there is water, cold, dark, heavy water, capable of swallowing what falls into it and keeping it. Alongside it comes a different moral pressure, because to destroy a ferry carrying a valuable cargo means striking something moving through the ordinary world, a world in which strategic necessity and human cost are never truly separable. This part of the story is especially adult in its gravity. War here allows no clean moral categories. Yes, the cargo had to be stopped. Yes, the ferry had to be sunk. But behind every such necessity lies a reality that can never be made wholly pure or beyond argument. War offers no flawless decisions. More often, it forces men to choose not between good and bad, but between dangerous and worse. The resistance chose. An explosive charge was placed on the ferry. Timing mattered. Placement mattered. Everything mattered. Once again, the shape of the operation reveals the sort of men carrying it out. Not men of noise, but men of exactness. When the hydro sank, it took the cargo with it. That completed something larger than sabotage. It completed a pattern of interruption. First, the plant was struck. Then the attempt to preserve the surviving value of what remained was struck as well. The work was not merely damaged, it was repeatedly denied continuity. And that is crucial. War is full of repairs and recoveries. What is broken one day may be rebuilt another. The true art of sabotage lies not only in destruction, but in the breaking of sequence, in preventing continuation, in forcing the enemy to spend more time, more effort, and more confidence than he can afford. That is what happened in Norway. The shape of the whole story is what gives it such force. There was fear, then waiting, then failure, then death, then more waiting, then renewed action, then infiltration, then destruction, then one more cold decision across dark water. At so many points, the entire story might have ended differently. With resignation, with arrest, with exhaustion, with some small physical error in the mountains, with a sound made at the wrong time, with the inability of men to keep carrying a mission after seeing its first version destroyed. Instead, it continued. And that continuation is the core of the story. Not simply the destruction of a facility, not simply the striking of a ferry, but the refusal of a handful of men to let one disaster become the whole truth. That is why the story of heavy water carries such power. Not because it is scientific, not because it touches the shadow of nuclear fear, not because later generations could attach large historical meaning to it, but because it reveals the scale at which human beings can matter in war. Not always in battalions, not always in divisions, not always through speeches or flags. Sometimes in a file of men crossing snow under the weight of silence, trying to reach a place they were never meant to reach. In that sense, the sabotage of Vemork is one of the purest war stories there is. A dangerous possibility somewhere in the distance, a small group sent into frozen terrain, a first attempt destroyed, a second approach through hardship, a precise blow, and a final act to ensure the damage could not simply be undone. It does not need exaggeration. Reality has already done the work. It remains memorable because it belongs equally to strategy and to weather, to science and to hunger, to global fear, and to the raw fact of a man taking one more step through snow because the mission is not yet finished. That is how some of the most important things in war are done. Not in the easiest place, not with the greatest number of men, not at the loudest moment, but in the cold, in silence, at the edge of exhaustion, by people who understand that history sometimes waits inside one narrow task and must be reached before the enemy understands what is happening. That was Norway. That was Vemork. That was the long, cold sabotage of heavy water.